The ambient temperature inside the primary fabrication bay registered at exactly 104 degrees Fahrenheit. My name is Gustavo Wilson. I stood before the roaring gas forge, my heavy leather welding apron absorbing the radiant heat. I held a 3-foot length of 1-inch carbon steel bar stock in the blue core of the flame, waiting for the dense metal to reach a precise, malleable, bright cherry red. I am a custom metal fabricator. My professional domain is dictated entirely by tensile strength, yield points, metallurgical fatigue, and the absolute laws of physics. Steel does not manipulate. It either bears the structural load, or it predictably fractures. I pulled the glowing steel from the forge with long-handled iron tongs, transferring it fluidly to the scarred surface of my 300-pound Peter Wright anvil. I raised my 4-pound crosspeen hammer and struck the metal. The deafening, rhythmic ring of steel striking hot steel echoed violently off the thick concrete walls of my ground floor workshop. I worked the metal for precisely 4 minutes, shaping the heavy stock into an industrial mounting bracket before setting the hammer down to allow the piece to normalize in the ambient air. I stripped off my thick, heat-resistant Kevlar gloves, the coarse fabric slick with my own sweat. I reached for my digital tablet resting on the secondary workbench, intending to check an incoming materials invoice from Clara, my primary commercial steel supplier. I tapped the screen, entering my passcode to unlock the device. Clara had sent a direct link to a newly launched, localized neighborhood networking application, suggesting I register my fabrication services for local commercial clients who required custom architectural ironwork. I clicked the hyperlink out of mild, operational necessity. The application loaded clumsily. Due to a severe back-end routing error in the beta software, the platform did not direct my browser to the commercial vendor directory. It bypassed the professional firewall entirely, dropping my geographic coordinates directly into the localized, private dating module of the application. The very first profile populating the geographic grid belonged to the woman who occupied apartment 2B, located exactly 14 vertical feet above my forge. Alice Torres, 39. I recognized her immediately from her photograph. I knew Alice by the soft, rhythmic sound of her pacing across her hardwood floors late at night, and by the faint, distinct scent of linseed oil and turpentine that always lingered in the industrial stairwell after she passed. We operated in entirely separate, non-intersecting realities. My world was heavy machinery, grinding dust, and blinding arc flashes. Hers was delicate watercolor paper, quiet music, and fine-tipped architectural pens. We exchanged polite, exceedingly brief nods when checking the mail in the lobby. I kept my distance. I did not intend to read her biographical data. My thumb simply brushed the flawed interface as I reached for my insulated water bottle, unintentionally expanding her full profile page. The text rendered in stark black against the bright white screen. I am 39. I illustrate children's books for a living, which means I spend most of my time alone in a loft talking to fictional badgers. My last relationship ended because my partner decided I was too old to start over and lacked long-term financial stability. I am exhausted by pretending I don't want someone to share a quiet cup of coffee with in the morning. Looking for a younger man who doesn't mind a messy apartment or the smell of paint? Neighbor preferred? Someone who already knows how loud I play my jazz records on Sundays and hasn't filed a noise complaint yet. The stark vulnerability of the text hit me with the physical density of a dropped anvil. It was not a curated, cynical piece of modern digital marketing. It was a raw, unprotected confession, unintentionally broadcast to the entire industrial block due to a software glitch. I immediately closed the application, shutting off the screen, shoving the heavy tablet into the deep pocket of my work trousers. The sudden, biological urge to protect her privacy from the rest of the building spiked sharply in my jaw. I am not a man who interferes in the domestic lives of others, but leaving a structural vulnerability exposed goes against every professional instinct I possess. I grabbed a clean shop rag, wiped the heavy layer of carbon dust and grease from my forearms, and walked out of the fabrication bay. I took the heavy concrete stairs to the second floor, my steel-toed boots echoing rhythmically in the quiet, drafty corridor. I stopped in front of the heavy steel fire door of apartment 2B. I raised my fist to knock, but I did not have to. The door was already propped open by a ceramic drafting stool to allow the cool evening cross breeze to circulate. However, the space was not quiet. A loud, aggressively bureaucratic voice was currently bouncing off the exposed brick walls of her studio, dominating the acoustic environment. You are in direct, undeniable violation of municipal fire and safety codes, Miss Torres, the voice announced with weaponized condescension. I recognized the abrasive frequency immediately. Sterling, He was the property management proxy for the building's new ownership group, a man who weaponized administrative bylaws to terrorize the independent artists who leased these historic lofts. I stepped into the open doorway, remaining silent, assessing the physical layout. Alice stood near the center of her massive, chaotic studio. She wore oversized, paint-splattered gray sweatpants and a faded white t-shirt. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy, utilitarian knot, held precariously in place by two wooden paintbrushes. She had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, physically shrinking away from Sterling's aggressive, invasive posture. Sterling stood holding a digital clipboard, pointing his expensive pen aggressively toward the back corner of the loft. "That industrial mezzanine," Sterling dictated loudly, ensuring his voice carried to maximum effect, "is an unpermitted, non-weight-bearing structure. You have loaded the platform with 3 massive steel flat files containing hundreds of pounds of archival paper. You have exceeded the physical load capacity of those original cast-iron support brackets by a minimum of 400%. It is a catastrophic safety hazard." "Mr. Sterling," Alice argued, her voice trembling slightly, lacking the sharp edge required to combat a corporate predator. "The mezzanine has been there since this building was a textile factory in the 1970s. The leasing agent explicitly told me I could use it for archival storage when I signed the contract. Verbal assurances from former employees are legally void," Sterling sneered, leveraging his administrative power. "The cast iron brackets are severely fatigued. The structure is visibly bowing under the dead weight. I am officially issuing a 7-day notice to cure or quit. If that mezzanine is not structurally reinforced to modern commercial code by a licensed metallurgical contractor by Friday at 1700 hours, I am revoking your lease and padlocking this studio on Monday morning." "I can't afford a commercial fabrication crew by Friday," Alice whispered, the panic finally breaking through her fragile composure. The color drained from her face. "My last book advance is completely tied up in international publishing delays. If you lock me out, I lose my entire physical archive. I lose my business. Then I strongly suggest you start packing your boxes." Sterling smiled, a thin, cruel expression. He turned to leave, his expensive leather shoes pivoting sharply on the hardwood floor. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me standing in the doorway, my broad shoulders entirely blocking his egress route. "Wilson," Sterling said, his tone instantly shifting from domineering patriarch to cautious bureaucrat. He looked at my soot-stained canvas jacket and the heavy musculature of my forearms, calculating the physical disparity. "This is a private tenant assessment. Step aside and clear the hallway." I did not shout. "Volume is an inefficient use of kinetic energy." I spoke softly, my voice a gentle, lethal blade designed to cut through his artificial authority. "The structural integrity of historical cast iron is not determined by a purely visual assessment from a property manager holding a plastic clipboard," I stated, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact with him. I did not move a single inch from the center of the door frame. "The metal is visibly bowing," Sterling snapped, attempting to salvage his narrative in front of Alice. "It's a documented hazard. She is operating a commercial storage unit in a residential space. I hold an active commercial contractor license and an AWS D1. 1 structural welding certification," I replied calmly, citing the exact credentials required to dismantle his threat. "My official license number carries liability weight with the municipal building department. Your visual assessment carries nothing but malicious, localized intent. Leave the paperwork on the desk. You will have your verified structural compliance packet by Friday." Sterling glared at me, his mind rapidly calculating the mathematical probability of forcing me out of the doorway. The probability was 0. He dropped the citation onto a small wooden table, squeezed past my shoulder with extreme caution, and practically fled down the concrete stairwell. The heavy silence of the loft returned. Alice let out a long, shuddering breath, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes. The crushing weight of the eviction threat was visibly drowning her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice incredibly fragile. She dropped her hands, looking at me with red-rimmed eyes. "You shouldn't have done that, Gustavo. He's going to target your ground floor lease next. You can't just promise him a commercial structural certification. The raw materials and labor alone will cost thousands of dollars." I stepped fully into her studio. The space smelled of raw creativity, linseed oil, graphite, and old, thick paper. It was messy, highly chaotic, and entirely beautiful. "I do not make promises I cannot mathematically and physically execute," I said, my tone completely stripped of its usual gruff edge. I kept my voice low, grounding the erratic, terrified energy in the room. The cast iron brackets supporting your mezzanine are indeed suffering from severe metallurgical fatigue. Sterling is a parasite, but his structural observation was accidentally correct. The localized weight of your steel archival files is creating a critical shear force on the aging masonry bolts. Alice looked at the heavy steel cabinets resting on the elevated platform. So it really is going to collapse? Not if I reinforce the primary load path, I corrected. I pulled a heavy leather tape measure from my tool belt. I do not require a commercial crew. I require access to your studio and your absolute trust. I will fabricate high-tensile carbon steel support columns and heavy-duty gusset plates in my forge. I will weld them directly into the primary masonry of this building. It will bypass the fatigued cast iron entirely. She stared at me, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. Gustavo, why are you doing this? I can't pay your hourly rate. I'm a 39-year-old woman drowning in debt trying to draw badgers for a living. We've spoken exactly 3 times in 2 months. I looked down at the floor, carefully selecting my operational parameters. I would not lie to her, but I would not weaponize her vulnerability. Clara sent me a link to the neighborhood networking application an hour ago, I stated softly, keeping my eyes fixed on the hardwood to give her privacy. The software suffered a massive back-end routing error. It displayed the private biographies. I saw your text. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She staggered backward a half-step, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. The sheer, agonizing humiliation of knowing her most private thoughts had been read by the man standing in her studio caused her breathing to become instantly shallow. "Oh my God," she choked out, her face burning with a dark flush. She turned entirely away from me, wrapping her arms around herself. "You read it. You saw what I wrote. Please, just leave. Please, I can't look at you." I did not leave. I took 2 deliberate, measured steps forward, stopping exactly 3 feet behind her, maintaining a strict, unyielding physical boundary. "I saw text," I said gently, my voice a quiet, unyielding anchor in the storm of her panic. "I did not read it as a weakness. Alice, I read it as a highly courageous statement of intent. You possess 39 years of structural integrity. You survived a massive system failure in your previous relationship, and you are actively rebuilding your foundation." She stopped trembling. The quiet certainty of my words bypassed her panic, engaging her logic. She slowly turned her head to look at me over her shoulder. "You aren't laughing at me?" she whispered. "I do not find genuine vulnerability humorous," I replied, meeting her eyes. "Sterling is attempting to utilize a mechanical failure to force you out of your sanctuary. I will not allow that. The perimeter is compromised. I am going to fix the steel. The rest is entirely irrelevant until you are physically and legally safe." "Do I have your consent to measure the load path?" Alice stared into my eyes, searching the unyielding lines of my face for pity. She found none. She found only concrete, lethal competence. She turned fully around, dropping her arms. "Yes, you have my consent. For the next 48 hours, the dynamic shifted from passive proximity to intense, synchronized execution. I spent the daylight hours in my ground floor forge. The heat was brutal, the physical toll immense. I utilized an oxyacetylene torch to precisely cut quarter-inch carbon steel plate, shaping massive, heavy-duty gusset brackets. I fired the forge, heating 3-inch diameter steel pipe until it glowed a blinding, translucent, white-hot, bending the bases to precisely match the specific angle of Alice's brick walls. I hammered the metal until my shoulders burned, transforming raw iron into a calculated, load-bearing architecture. In the evenings, I carried the heavy, fabricated components up the concrete stairs to her studio. The first night I arrived, she had meticulously cleared the space beneath the mezzanine. She stood by her drafting table, watching me haul 70 pounds of raw steel into her delicate environment. "I need to grind the old paint and rust off the primary anchor points before I can lay the root pass with the TIG welder," I instructed, setting my heavy equipment down on a specialized fire-resistant fiberglass blanket. "The grinder will be extremely loud. It will generate a massive shower of sparks. You should retreat to the far side of the loft to avoid inhalation." "I'm not leaving you to work alone in my apartment," she stated firmly, grabbing a pair of clear safety glasses from her own small toolkit. She put them on, the harsh plastic frames contrasting sharply with her soft, exhausted features. "Tell me what to hold." We established a silent, highly efficient rhythm. I fired up the heavy angle grinder, the high-pitched, screaming whine echoing violently off the brick, showering the localized area in bright orange sparks. Alice didn't flinch. She stood near the wall, holding a heavy fire-retardant shield precisely where I directed, protecting her delicate watercolor paintings from the flying slag. When the grinding was complete, the silence returning to the room felt incredibly heavy. My arms were coated in fine, dark, metallic dust. Alice walked over to her small kitchenette. She did not ask if I wanted anything. She simply brewed a pot of incredibly bitter, strong black tea and handed me a ceramic mug. "Your hands are shaking," I noted softly, accepting the mug. Our fingers brushed. The transfer of heat was instantaneous, an unregulated variable that caused a distinct spike in my baseline heart rate. She looked down at her hands. "It's just the adrenaline from the noise. I'm fine." I set the mug down on a safe, cleared work surface. I did not offer a therapeutic analysis of her stress. I utilized an act of physical service. I walked past her, toward the large, industrial window near her drafting table. I had noticed it rattling loudly during a gust of wind earlier, compromising the thermal envelope of the room. The heavy brass latch was completely sheared off, forcing her to wedge a heavy textbook into the frame to keep it shut against the winter draft. I pulled a pair of heavy locking pliers and a spare, custom-milled steel pin from my tool belt. I gripped the broken mechanism, manually realigning the internal torsion spring with brutal force, and drove the new steel pin into the housing with a single, sharp strike of my hammer. The window locked flawlessly, sealing the cold draft permanently out of the room. I turned back to her. "The environmental seal is restored. The draft will no longer arbitrarily affect your paint drying times." Alice stared at the window, then looked at me. The defensive armor she wore around Sterling had completely dissolved. "I didn't even ask you to fix that. I do not require a formal request to repair a broken system," I said quietly, picking my mug back up. "I will commence the welding sequence now. The ultraviolet arc flash will permanently damage your retinas if you look directly at it without a shade 10 filter. Turn your back to the mezzanine." She obeyed instantly, turning to face her drafting table. I dropped my heavy, auto-darkening welding hood over my face. I activated the tungsten inert gas welder. The machine hummed with immense electrical power. I struck the arc. The blinding, brilliant blue-white light illuminated the dark corner of the studio. I fed the filler rod into the molten puddle of steel, seamlessly fusing the new heavy-duty carbon column directly to the existing structural frame. It required absolute, microscopic precision. If the argon shielding gas flow rate was too low, atmospheric oxygen would contaminate the weld, creating internal porosity and severe structural weakness. I managed the variables perfectly, laying a flawless, stacked dime bead of steel along the entire joint. I extinguished the arc and lifted my hood. The localized area smelled sharply of ozone and intensely heated metal. "The primary root pass is complete," I announced, my voice slightly raspy from the metallic fumes. Alice turned around. She looked at the massive, raw steel column, now permanently and undeniably anchored into her brick wall. She looked at the sweat dripping from my jawline. "You build permanent things, Gustavo," she whispered, her voice carrying a profound, emotional weight. "I build things designed to withstand intense, external pressure," I corrected, unhooking the heavy leather straps of my apron. "The final cap pass will be completed tomorrow. The structure will be secure. Thursday morning, 1,000 hours." The timeline forcefully, unexpectedly accelerated. I was in Alice's studio, laying the final, reinforcing cap pass on the secondary support column. The welding arc was blinding. I was entirely focused on manipulating the molten puddle of steel. Suddenly, my peripheral vision registered a harsh, flashing light. I killed the arc instantly, snapping my hood up. Sterling was standing inside the loft. He had bypassed the propped-open door. Standing beside him was a man wearing a bright yellow municipal safety vest, holding a digital tablet. A city building inspector. Sterling had brought him 48 hours early to catch us off guard and initiate an immediate lockout. "There it is," Sterling announced loudly, pointing a dramatic, accusing finger directly at me. "Unpermitted, highly dangerous hot work being performed in a densely populated residential zone. Shut the equipment down, Wilson. Inspector, red tag the unit immediately. I want her formally evicted by noon." Alice stood near her drafting table, the color draining from her face. The sudden invasion of her sanctuary triggered an immediate panic response. She backed away, her hands trembling violently, clutching a wooden paintbrush like a desperate weapon. He wasn't supposed to be here until tomorrow, she stammered, her breathing shallow and erratic. I unhooked my welding stinger and set it safely on the fire-resistant blanket. I stepped directly between Alice and the two men, establishing an impenetrable, physical perimeter. The scheduled compliance review is Friday at 1,700 hours, I stated, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, absolute register. You have intentionally breached the timeline. The timeline is irrelevant when life safety is at risk, Sterling sneered, heavily leveraging the presence of the municipal official. You're operating a high-voltage TIG welder indoors without clearance. That's a massive fire code violation. The lease is officially void. The inspector stepped forward, looking at the massive steel columns I had fabricated. Sir, I need to see your approved hot work permit for this facility immediately. I did not panic. I reached into the deep, zippered pocket of my canvas jacket. I pulled out a thick, folded sheaf of heavily stamped, official municipal documents. I did not hand them to Sterling. I handed them directly to the inspector. Document 1 is a fully approved emergency structural mitigation permit, specifically authorizing shielded inert gas welding in Unit 2B. I dictated. My voice a steady, rhythmic hammer, striking an anvil. I filed it yesterday, paid the municipal after-hours processing fee, and maintained a certified fire watch during all active hot work. Document 2 is my active commercial contractor license and my AWSD 1-1 structural welding certification. Sterling's smug expression faltered violently. Document 3. I continued relentlessly, pointing to the next page in the packet, is a certified, engineered schematic detailing the exact load path redistribution I am currently executing. The new carbon steel columns possess a verified yield strength of 42,000 psi. They exceed the municipal commercial load requirements for an archival mezzanine by a factor of 6. The inspector reviewed the documents carefully, his eyes scanning my contractor license number printed at the top of the permit packet. He pulled a pen from his vest and signed his initials across the bottom line. He looked up, nodding respectfully. The paperwork is flawless, Mr. Wilson. The hot work permit is active and valid. The structural mitigation is approved. He's still violating the localized zoning ordinances, Sterling shouted, his face flushing dark red as his primary leverage evaporated into thin air. He pointed frantically at Alice. She's running an illegal commercial storage facility in a purely residential unit. Fine her. The inspector frowned, tapping a few keys on his digital tablet to pull up the city database. Actually, Mr. Sterling, the inspector said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy, reading directly from the screen. The municipal parcel data here shows this specific building was officially rezoned for dual-use commercial and residential in 2008. Her archival storage is completely compliant with the current municipal code. I took one deliberate, heavy step towards Sterling, utilizing my physical size to project an aura of unyielding dominance. Your attempt to utilize a fatigued cast iron bracket as a weapon to force a fraudulent eviction is mathematically and legally absurd, I corrected quietly, forcing him to physically lean back to avoid my proximity. I looked directly into Sterling's panicked eyes. The structural threat is neutralized. The permit packet is verified and signed off by the city, I whispered. The words meant only for him. If you ever cross the threshold of this studio again without a legally mandated 24-hour notice, I will personally file a civil harassment suit against the building management, utilizing these stamped documents and the inspector's presence as proof of your targeted administrative negligence. Get out. Sterling stared at the solid wall of my chest. He looked at the inspector, who was already walking back toward the door. Entirely satisfied with the compliance documentation, Sterling realized he had completely lost the engagement. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the loft, slamming the heavy steel door behind him. The deafening silence returned. I turned around. Alice was standing by her desk. The paintbrush had fallen from her hands. She was staring at me, her eyes wide, shining with a mixture of profound awe and overwhelming, crushing relief. You filed the emergency permits, she breathed, her voice cracking. You knew he would try to blindside us. I do not leave perimeters unsecured, I replied, my voice losing its hard, lethal edge, returning to a gentle rumble. I began unhooking my heavy leather welding gear. The structural integrity of the mezzanine is fully restored. The legal vulnerability is permanently patched. He cannot touch your lease. Alice didn't speak. She walked slowly across the hardwood floor. The defensive armor she had worn for months completely dissolved. She stopped exactly 1 foot in front of me. You completely dismantled him, she said softly, looking up into my face. You stood in front of me and took apart my worst nightmare in under 3 minutes, using the law. He operated on a flawed psychological premise, I corrected, keeping my hands resting firmly on my tool belt, refusing to cross the final boundary without her explicit consent. He assumed you were isolated. He failed to account for external reinforcement. He didn't know I had a blacksmith in my corner, she smiled. A radiant, unguarded expression that sent a sudden, sharp spike of heat directly into my chest. She reached out. She didn't hesitate. She placed her palm flat against the center of my chest, right over my sternum, right over the heavy, rapid thudding of my heart. Your heart is racing, Gustavo, she murmured, her thumb lightly tracing the rough canvas fabric of my work shirt. It is a biological response to an unregulated variable, I admitted, my voice dropping to a rough whisper. The cynical, isolated detachment I had maintained for years was entirely fractured by her touch. Is it a dangerous variable? She asked, stepping a fraction of an inch closer. Her eyes locked onto mine. No, I replied. I lifted my right hand, my calloused fingers wrapping gently over hers where it rested against my chest. I held her hand firmly, abandoning the role of the distant, objective observer. It is the safest, most structurally sound variable I have encountered in a decade. Alice smiled, her breath hitching softly. She didn't demand a grand, dramatic, romantic speech. She understood the profound language of actions. I reached into the pocket of my trousers. I pulled out a small, heavy object and placed it into her other hand. Alice looked down. It was a custom-forged, carbon steel key. I replaced the lock cylinder on your front door yesterday evening, after you handed me the spare and gave me permission to secure the perimeter while you were working. I explained quietly, reinforcing the trust we had built. The old mechanism was fatigued. This key is fabricated from high-tensile steel. It will not bend. She curled her fingers tightly around the cold metal, looking back up at me, the meaning of the gesture perfectly clear. Your dating profile contained specific parameters, I stated, my thumb lightly tracing the back of her knuckles. It requested a younger man, a neighbor, someone who does not object to the smell of turpentine or a messy environment. It did, she whispered, her eyes shining. I meet all operational criteria, I confirmed. Absolute loyalty anchoring every syllable, if you still want that. The coffee is brewing at 0700, Alice promised, leaning her forehead gently against my chest, claiming the sanctuary I had built. I will be here, I said. The end.